Welcome to The Know, I'm Ashley.
I'm Brian.
It's no secret that things have been kind of tough at BioWare these days. The developer's seen a lot of veteran talent leave. The last major game they put out, Mass Effect Andromeda, was a huge flop, resulted in the closure of the studio that made it, and has temporarily, at least, put Mass Effect as a franchise on ice, which sucks, and we're never going to get our Quarian Arc DLC, but here we are.
Some have also reported that if the studio's upcoming game, the sci-fi multiplayer shooter Anthem, isn't a hit, that it could be curtains for one of the biggest developers in video games.
Just the pressure they needed. Now one of those departing BioWare veterans is talking about his experience with the developer and how it's changed over the years and how the studio's changed.
In an interview with Game Informer, James Olin, who is responsible for heading up some of BioWare's biggest games historically, like Star Wars: The Old Republic, Baldur's Gate 2, and Neverwinter Nights.
So basically some awesome games.
Big time. He talked about leaving the company and the pressures of working in big budget games.
He also addressed some rumors about the kind of influence that parent company EA has, as well as how much the studio has riding on the success of Anthem and on whether it could actually be shutters if this one doesn't work out.
He talked about it. While Olin was very complimentary of the developer, he still dropped a few clues about what it's like making AAA games nowadays and how the culture inside the studio has changed over the years.
And it has.
Yeah.
Judging from the interview, sounds like it's a very incredibly stressful job managing AAA projects that involve several hundreds of people. No surprise there. At one point, he actually compared it to steering the Titanic. So basically, the idea of being able to make little changes here and there and guide the course, but tough to steer a ship of that size. It's not nimble. It's not going to turn on a dime.
It seemed like more of a size metaphor rather than BioWare is sinking into the bottom of the ocean.
Hopefully.
He was asked by Game Informer if the culture at BioWare is still intact. Olin said he thinks it still is, and he called it a culture of humility and a culture of excellence. But he also said that BioWare's had to evolve because games are getting more and more expensive and teams are getting larger and larger. So it's been difficult, but I think the studio's leaders have done a great job.
On the one hand, it's not a huge surprise. I guess like if you're in the business of making AAA games, development costs and staffs are getting bigger and bigger, and that's not unique to BioWare. That's sort of a trend across the industry. First, we were looking at triple digits on development teams. Now we're looking at quadruple digits. You're like, Ubisoft's got 5 studios working on this game, and it's just becoming these behemoth projects.
Yeah, game development over the years has also evolved. So in a lot of these bigger projects, you might have, like you said, studios in multiple locations working on them, and each of those studios might have slightly different cultures of their own. And these devs are working with teams they've never met. It could be all over the world. It's doable, but does remove a layer of kind of the tight-knit unity you tend to see with smaller teams.
Right, it's a little bit harder to feel all in the trenches together when everyone's sort of scattered around and you don't know the face to go with the names on the emails.
Right, like Stardew Valley, that was his vision.
Right.
He wasn't answering to anybody else.
He was very tight-knit.
That's what Concerned Ape wanted to make.
So Olin said, "The Old Republic, I was the game director, which meant I had the most power, but I often felt like I was the captain of the Titanic and I could just steer it a teeny tiny bit if I put all my efforts into it."
But he did say that the studio has had to evolve with that. Olin was then asked why he thought a bunch of veteran developers have been leaving BioWare. He seemed to attribute that to a combination of time. You know, everybody's a lifer at their company and sometimes they want to go do something else.
Yeah.
And the pressure of, again, working on these giant games. It sounds like it just... It kind of gets to you after a while. It just becomes, you know, you need a break.
Sure. According to Olin, a lot of people who have been leaving were there for 10, 15 or more years, and sometimes you just need a change. Other times people want to get back to getting their hands dirty with creative, and it's really difficult to do that when you're on a big team of 1,000 people and you're supposed to be delivering hundreds of $millions in revenue.
But the real kicker was this quote. There's a lot of responsibility there that kind of gets in the way of your ability to really get into the creative process.
And look, he wasn't being critical of BioWare with that quote, but it is possible to read that quote and conclude the studio has changed a lot since its Baldur's Gate days, and that the money consideration does seem to be present at really every stage of development at a level that it wasn't before.
Yeah, the reality is BioWare is now a huge developer. It's partnered with EA, owned by EA, I guess, and has to be concerned with the bottom line. And as Olin said, sometimes I can get in the way of the creative process.
And on some level, that's just how all big companies work, and that's just increasingly becoming the case. When you're owned by a huge, huge company like EA, there are a lot of bosses to answer to. It's probably not possible to just make a decision on your own and then implement it, hence the Titanic reference. There's all this red tape to go through. There are all of these other stakeholders. There are all these other approvers and managers.
And to be clear, no developer, even small ones that aren't owned by EA, can ever really ignore the market realities and create just whatever they want at whatever scale they want without consideration for how much money they can make from it.
I mean, that sounds nice.
Right. That's a little utopian, though. There are a few developers who find success that way, but most of them fail because they run out of money and can't keep the lights on.
That thy reach exceed thy craft.
Yes.
But I'm sure EA's history of shuttering studios that don't perform adds enough pressure that we start to see that kind of burnout, like the, oh god, this has to be good, this has to be success. What are we doing? Is this going to sell to enough people? I mean, especially with the ghost of visceral lingering.
Right. They're not afraid to close down a studio,
nope.
As we know. Some fans have felt like EA's influence has been harmful toward BioWare, and there are a lot of theories that it's the reason why Anthem seems like it's going to be a very different game from what a lot of people consider to be a typical BioWare title.
Well, and it doesn't really help that BioWare hasn't been amazing at communicating exactly what Anthem is or isn't. There's a lot of vague sort of references. Their direction may have evolved over time. A year ago, we all thought it was going to be kind of like Destiny, and now they're saying, no, it's going to be mostly single player-ish. So a lot of that is possibly still shifting behind the scenes, but at the moment, it doesn't look like Anthem is going to have the kind of branching conversations or a lot of the classic hallmarks of games that we've come to know and expect from the studio in recent years.
Yeah, and Olin was asked about Anthem being a departure from the traditional BioWare game, and he replied that the studio has always taken risks, always tried different things, and that's what it's doing with Anthem.
But he added, I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories that EA is the one behind it, but that's never been the case. BioWare's always had a lot of control over the kinds of games it makes.
Olin also addressed the issue of whether or not Anthem is a make or break game for the studio, because that has been reported.
A lot.
Yep.
It's a big worry for a lot of people that after something like Andromeda, where that game failure closed that studio down, this could happen more across the BioWare studios.
Yeah, there's not a lot of places that can survive two flops, two big budget flops.
Olin denied that that's the case, saying that BioWare will survive whether or not Anthem is a flop. So that's good news. He said that EA respects what BioWare brings to the table, and he thinks that EA is looking for the studio to be a long-term part of the company.
He said, even if Anthem doesn't do as well, and I think it's going to be great, but if it doesn't do gangbusters, I don't think that's the end of BioWare.
And you know, when you look back over the history of BioWare's games, it is true they've evolved, and the types of games they make have evolved. I mean, Mass Effect is a very different type of game than a Baldur's Gate or Neverwinter Nights. So they do have that sort of evolution. It's not the first time they've done something out of their norm. It's, like, honestly, it's kind of built into the studio to change over time.
Yeah, and sometimes their games haven't been huge hits. Look at Dragon Age 2 as an example. Even within that series, it's shifted and evolved to find what works and what doesn't work.
Well, and maybe part of the difference now is that teams of 1,000 people are very expensive, and like Olin said, that kind of thing creates this pressure that tends to put market success ahead of pure creativity.
Now again, it's important to note that overall, Olin was very positive on BioWare and his 22-year career there. It's clear he has a lot of good memories working there, even as he said, after they were acquired by EA.
But it's also true, he left for a reason. In Olin's case, he wants to write adventures based on Dungeons & Dragons games. His newest project, called Arcanum Worlds, is going to create new adventures for the legendary role-playing game. That's D&D has always sort of seemed to be his passion in particular, so I think it's really awesome that he's getting into it, and there is a market for a lot of D&D stuff. I feel like D&D's making a huge, I don't know if it's a resurgence or if just more people are becoming aware of it, but good on him, I say.
Yeah,
chase your bliss.
Yeah, and he seems ready to get back into more of a creative role. And from the sound of the interview, it might be harder to do that these days at BioWare.
Yeah, so a lot of us see his departure as a big loss for BioWare. His work on Baldur's Gate 2, on Neverwinter Nights, on Old Republic. I mean, he worked on some of the big games that made BioWare what it is. And so, loss for BioWare, but good on Olin for doing what he wants to do creatively.
Yeah, he's been quoted as kind of being like a definitional talent of BioWare. So when he leaves, I mean, something leaves with him. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. This might just add fuel to the fire for some who feel like the studio's lost its way over the last several years.
Or you know what, Anthem could be a huge hit, and then BioWare is right back on top of things. That's how quickly everything can change, and we'll have to wait until next February to find out. I'd very much like to see them move away from February 22nd, because that's when every game in the world is apparently coming out. And they did say, BioWare did say they thought that Mass Effect Andromeda releasing in a very crowded market at that time of year was part of the reason it didn't do as well as it could have.
So let's do it again.
Yeah, so
this time.
I'm a little bit worried, but I want Anthem to be good. I want it to be a success.
Big time.
All right, what do you guys think of this interview? Sign that BioWare's lost its way, natural evolution of a studio as games get bigger and more ambitious and more expensive with larger team sizes. Let us know in the comments.
And for all your BioWare news, be sure to like this video. If you're new around here, subscribe to the know.
Nolan said, "The Old Republic, I was the game director, which meant I had the most power, but I often felt like I was the captain of the Titanic and I could just steer it a teeny tiny bit, but if I..."
EA.
But it's also true. He left for a reason. In Olin's case, he wants to write adventures based on Dungeons and Dragon games. Dungeons and Dragon.